Now, going on to further this description on a scriptural level, in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is revealed in chapter 11, the Vishvarupa Darshan, the cosmic form of Lord Krishna. Now, upon seeing that cosmic form, Arjuna has a reaction. He describes what he's seeing. And one of the descriptions that Arjuna says to Krishna in chapter 11, verse 12, is he says the following: if 1,000 suns were to rise at once in the sky, the resulting magnificence may be somewhat like the effulgence of that mighty one which he has just seen. So notice that he is talking about an effulgence so grand, a nature, a form, a being, a reality perhaps, so grand, so beyond what we are capable of perceiving, that it is like the effulgence and magnificence of 1,000 suns. Now think of this for a second as a metaphor, not as a literal interpretation that what he was seeing was 1,000 suns. The metaphor being, we can't even bear to look at one sun. The brightness is too much for our instruments, in this case, our eyes. So imagine the effulgence projected by thousands of suns. So this is simply Arjuna illustrating the absolute magnitude and nature of what he is seeing. We also have to remember that in that chapter, Krishna says to Arjuna that I give you the eyes by which you can have this divine vision. Essentially, Krishna gifts him supernatural eyes so that the instruments are adequate to be able to perceive what he has earned, the vision, the Vishwarupa Darshanam, the cosmic form of God, Brahman, as we are discussing here today. So this just goes further to emphasize this idea that God, although he is something, a being, a reality, and perhaps we can discuss later on whether that something is personal and impersonal. At this stage, what we're trying to highlight is the absolute difficulty of pinning a description down, pinning God down to one particular concept, image, form, or description. Okay? Now, I want to get straight into one of the biggest topics surrounding the notion of God in Hinduism. And that topic is whether Hinduism, as an entire culture, is ultimately monotheistic, polytheistic, pantheism, or panenteism. Now, you might not have heard of the last term or perhaps the last two terms. So I'm first of all going to define all those terms for you. The first one, monotheism, is perhaps the easiest one and most commonly understood, is the belief in the existence of only one God. Now, there are different types of monotheism, different interpretations. For example, the Judeo-Christian traditions, the Abrahamic faiths, in the Christian sense, monotheism is still characterized by the Trinity of Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, whereas perhaps in Islam, the idea of monotheism is singular to Allah. These are monotheistic concepts. Even if in the case of Christianity, when there is a Trinity, the Trinity is qualified as being actually one being, expressing himself in three different ways, or expressing itself. Now, many schools have taught, and perhaps I myself have taught in other courses, that Hinduism also falls under that kind of monotheistic concept. The idea that reality is one, or God, the Supreme, is one, but expresses himself or itself in a variety of different forms. So, as the Christians would perhaps have three expressions of the Supreme, the Hindus would have 3 or 33 or 330 million expressions. There are various different takes on it. Essentially, that is one acceptable concept of Hinduism, and yet it doesn't fully encapsulate the true depth of the concept of God in Hinduism. And so for this lecture today, I am not going to associate Hindu thought and Hinduism in general as a monotheistic tradition, although that is a justifiable position. Now the second, polytheism, is the one that is often cheaply and easily branded upon Hinduism, but under all circumstances, incorrectly so. Hinduism is not polytheistic. Polytheism is the belief in numerous gods. But it doesn't emphasize the origin being one only, or the supremacy of one God above others. So polytheism is not a suitable description of Hinduism, simply put, because all the Vedic literatures, at the very minimum, propose Brahman, this neutrally posted term, as the one and only source of all beings, the ground of all existence. So if we speak of multiple gods, we still speak of one source. That one singular source, as it is a conscious being, and this is something that we'll be exploring later on today, cannot therefore accommodate a polytheistic viewpoint towards it, because polytheism would suggest multiple coexisting equal supreme realities, so to speak. So no, that isn't it at all. Third is pantheism. Pantheism is an interesting concept. It means that pantheism is defined as an equal identification of God with the universe, i.e. God is all and all is God. The universe, however big it is God, and God is the universe. Now, that means that God does not extend beyond the universe, neither is God something lesser than the universe. So we often hear that in many spiritual movements, especially in our modern times, about people praying to the universe or calling onto the universe. This would fall into a sort of pantheistic worldview or vision of God. Now, is the universe God in Hinduism? Yes. Is God equal to the universe? Meaning God does not extend beyond the universe? No. And so, once again, pantheism is not the appropriate descriptor for the notion of God in Hinduism. So far we have monotheism, an acceptable term under very specific qualifications, polytheism as an unacceptable term, and pantheism as an unacceptable term to define the notion of God in Hinduism. Lastly, we have panentheism. Panentheism is the belief that God is greater than the universe and includes and permeates it. So it is a sort of evolution concept on pantheism. So once again, God equals the universe and beyond. So God, in a sense, encapsulates the universe, but extends himself beyond the universe, and God also permeates the universe. That is today's chosen descriptor for the notion of God in Hinduism. That Brahman, the supreme absolute truth, is existing within material creation as a permeating essence and beyond material creation. Therefore, it is neither separate from the universe fully, neither is it equal to the universe fully. It is both at the same time. Hinduism is therefore panentheistic, not monotheistic in a simplified interpretation, not polytheistic, and not pantheistic. And now I'm going to show you that in a diagram so that visually it becomes even clearer for you what I mean when I'm referring to this concept. In the diagram to my side, what you will see is a traditional theistic concept first, perhaps a Abrahamic concept of theism, that God and his creation are two separate things. One does not permeate the other, and one is not present within the other. One stems from the other, meaning one originates somewhere or comes from something, but is distinctly separate and shares no nature. For example, think of God as a creator in the sense of, and to use the appropriate Latin term, ex nihilo, that God creates out of nothing, the creation existing apart from him. On the flip side, you have a capsule where the blue shape is God and the purple sphere is the universe. Notice that the universe, the purple sphere, is contained within God. That means that everything that is in the universe, in the material creation, not only stems from God, but is present within God and is permeated by God. And yet God is not limited by this. God extends beyond this. Now we will hear later on in today's lecture a verse from the Bhagavad Gita from Krishna that best illustrates this particular point. So until then, this is the clearest definition or the clearest expression of these thoughts that you're going to have. The notion that God includes the universe but extends beyond it. God is not separate from the universe in the way depicted by the first image. So, Hinduism is panentheistic. As we move forward, one of the key questions that everyone also asks, and has already been touched upon by this topic, is whether God is ultimately transcendent, immanent, or both. This, in more simple language, perhaps, is the question, where is God? Is he here on earth? Is he somewhere else? And perhaps there is a concept in which he can be at both places at the same time. This is what is meant by this question. The word transcendent means that it goes beyond or exists apart from creation, apart from where we are now. Immanence means that this reality which we are speaking of is present here, immanently with us, not somewhere else beyond. So here I want to point us towards two different quotations from the Vedic literature. First of all, from the Chandogya Upanishad. Remember that the Upanishads are the philosophical portion of the Vedas. In the Chandogya Upanishad, we have one of the most famous expressions, that is, Sarvam Kalavidam Brahman. So this translates as God is all things, or Brahman is all things. Now, that seems to point towards a pantheism or pantheistic vision of the world, that God equates to all observable things, the universe, all creation, so to speak. And that would be perfectly fine, a perfectly acceptable interpretation, and it definitely points towards God's immanence, that God is present in all things because ultimately all things are God. We can discuss in what way, but at this stage we can leave it here. Sarva Kalavidam Brahman. God is all things. Yet in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says in chapter 10, verse 42, that I abide sustaining this whole universe with but a fraction of myself. I repeat, I abide sustaining this whole universe with but a fraction of myself. Therefore, we can see that Krishna equates himself as something far beyond the universe if he sustains and abides in this universe with just a fraction of himself. This would suppose God's transcendence, that he goes and extends far beyond the universe. When we come with these two quotations together, the Upanishadic idea that God is all things, things referring to a created material universe, and at the same time the Gita revelation that Krishna sustains this universe with but a fraction of himself, the only reasonable conclusion and answer we can reach is that the notion of God in Hinduism is that God is both transcendent and immanent. God is a reality that we can discover beyond this universe and, most importantly, experience beyond this universe, but beautifully and very, let's say, helpful to us is to also consider that God is present in this universe. He is right here. It is therefore something for us to know and discover and realize whilst we are embodied and once we are not embodied, whilst we reside in this universe and if we ever exist and transcend this universe. God remains present in both locations. Now, again, this raises a lot of questions. How, where, when? Where can I see him? How can I see him? All of these questions, or at least some of them, will be answered today. But I will stress one thing. A lot of this is explained quite clearly by Ramanuja's Vishishta Dvaitam philosophy. But that is already part of an analysis on Vedanta, Ramanuja, and Sri Vaishnavism, which is not really the crux of today's course, although it is heavily, heavily influenced by it. Now, what do I mean by that is that essentially we will look at this topic, i.e. the relationship between God and the universe, at a later date. just perhaps not today. Okay?